in charge of, among several teams of science communication at CISA. So why today we are here? So after the pandemic, we realized that there is a need of stimulate, at least in Italy, but I think also across Europe, there is a need of stimulating some thinking about science communication, something in which CISA has been a pioneer, because let me remind you that next year we will celebrate the 30th anniversary of our Master in Science Communication, which is the longest standing, it's the most successful master course in science communication in Italy. So, and after the pandemic, we realized that there was the need, at least for the Italian community, to gather again. And so last year, we organized again after a break of more than 10 years, almost 10 years actually, we organized again the National Congress in Science Communication, which I think it was a success again. Although it was done during COVID time with lots of restrictions and so on. So the idea was to then do this Congress, this National Congress every 2 years. And as an interlude, we decided that it would be wise to have anyhow some activity in science communication, which could, let's say, stimulate thinking about science communication with an international outlook. That's why we decided to organize this sort, if you want, a sort of small workshop on science communication, open to what happens also beyond the Italian borders. You know, science communication, that many things are nation specifics, but you know, some big themes are international. This year, then we put together this program, these 3 days, in which there will be lectures or seminars, but then there will be also ample time for discussion. I hope that the students in science communication will try to interact as much as they could with our guests. So this year also we have the possibility to, so the themes which have been chosen are important. So science diplomacy, artificial intelligence, then there is the problem of science, journals and science communication, and then the big problem of science publishing. And this year we had also the chance to celebrate, and this we will do thanks to a nice collaboration with the Media Lab, the 25th anniversary of JHEP, which again was a very nice experiment run by CISA, one of the most successful, I have to advertise my institution, one of the most successful experiments. And then, so the idea would be then, based on this, to think. So based on this, to have the possibility to think about what about the publishing of the future, in which I hope CISA and Media Lab will have again an important role in shaping what comes next. I mean, JHEP has been essentially one of the first electronic journals on the market. So in this sense, now all journals are essentially electronic. And then there will be also this very nice podcast, which is going to be presented soon about how a paper become a paper. Essentially, this is going to be in Italian. And then what else? Yeah, I mean, this is the big issue of trust in science, because this is really an important and especially now after the pandemic, has been one of the most important problems and issues in the international level.
Let me add, Andrea, if you don't mind, the 20th anniversary of JCOM, Journal of Science Communication. I
said without saying, actually. When I said the 20th, sorry, I didn't want to say. 20th anniversary of JCOM, which, by the way, I'll take it. Okay, now I understand why you were saying like this. So because it was, again, another experiment of CISA, inspired by the many experiments. Was this journal of science communication, essentially electronic, which is still run by Media, and there will be again, a reflection about this. So this said, I would like first to thank the people whom we put together the program. It is essentially Nico, Giacomo, and Alessandro. Specifically, then clearly the media partnership with Media Lab. We also acknowledge the media partnership with Le Scienze as far as the podcast and in general this event is concerned. And then I would like also to thank the ILA secretary, who is taking care of all the practical aspects which are usually non-negligible even for small size events like this. Then this said, Giacomo, are you going to introduce the speakers?
Yes.
He said, I wish you a successful, pleasant and inspiring 3-day workshop. Okay, thank you.
Oh, please ask Max Paoli from TWAS, the World Academy of Science, to take the floor and introduce our other guest, Dr. Mueller. Thank you.
Okay, good morning to you all. Good morning, Gianmarco.
Good morning, Max.
Good morning. I would like to, first of all, I would like to highly commend your initiative that we just heard now, the inspirational motivation behind this event. And in a few words, I would like to say why I highly commend it. And I think in the past 2-3 years, we've seen a pandemic which taught us something. Perhaps we didn't need to be taught that something, but unfortunately it did. And it taught us not only the importance of science, but the importance of communicating the science. We just heard now about the trust in science, but I'm going to focus on the communication myself. I would like also to mention another tremendous issue which went in the shadow because of the pandemic, an issue that right now is again in the foreground, which is the climate crisis. And we see in COP27, again, a lot of talk. Again, that talk, is it real communication? Is it effective communication? Is really the science going into the decisions that should be made? So that is a major question. And in fact, now, going back to those two issues, so COVID, I consider a short-term, medium-term crisis. The climate, I actually consider it a mid-term to long-term crisis. Nevertheless, whether it's one or the other, I see, sadly, a massive failure in the scientific evidence and the conclusions that derive from data. I see a failure of those making their way to policymakers and decision makers. So they're not sufficiently received, they're not sufficiently understood, and they're not sufficiently used. I'm not saying that it's, I don't know, your fault or our fault, but I think that underlines that there is a shortcoming in communicating science effectively. So there is an opportunity, and I see this as a huge opportunity for the future of science communication. Therefore, an event like this, an initiative like this, is to be highly commended. Policymaking must, in my view, must become more science-driven. How we achieve that, I don't know. I don't have the solutions, but it must be more science-driven. So there is a huge problem, which is that on one side you have policymakers, decision makers, politicians. The other side you have the scientists. And there's a gap between. There is a disconnect in the way they communicate or do not communicate. There is a disconnection. There is many reasons why there is this disconnection, maybe different ways of thinking, different priorities, different tools used, but also different language. The science policy gap is addressed partially by an initiative or a program that TWAS, the organization I come from, the World Academy of Sciences, also works in, and this is where TWAS and CISA can also collaborate or have collaborated, which is science diplomacy. But science diplomacy and science communications must go hand in hand in order to fill and bridge that gap that I mentioned. I think that science communication in the future can really focus very much on the skills that we need to bridge that science policy gap, to build a science policy dialogue. And on these particular issues, and also on the relationship between communications and diplomacy, science communication, science diplomacy, I'm extremely honored to introduce our guest speaker today, which is Dr. Jan Marco Mueller. So let me say a few words about him. Sorry, otherwise I can't see, unfortunately. So he is the coordinator for science diplomacy and multilateral relations at the European Commission, Research and Innovation, DG Research and Innovation. Now, following his PhD in geography, Jan Marco progressed in his career with management positions at environmental research centers in Germany, Italy, and the UK. After being an assistant to the General Director of the Joint Research Center, the JRC, from 2009 to 2012, he managed the Office of the Scientific Advisor to the President of the European Commission, and then helped setting up the Commission's current scientific advice mechanism. From 2017 to 2020, he worked in Vienna at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, as we know it as IASA. And there he was the coordinator for science diplomacy. In the last 2 years, he served as first science and technology advisor of the European External Action Service, known as EAS, before joining DG Research and Innovation as coordinator for science diplomacy and multilateral relations, as I said at the beginning. Of the European Commission. So I am convinced that he can provide us with very valuable insights. So thank you, Jan Marco. Please go ahead. We look forward to your talk.
Okay, thanks a lot, Max. Buongiorno a tutti. È un piacere stare con voi. So thank you very much. And I'm going to share my slides. And now we see whether it's going to work. Okay, so you should see them now.
Working.
Good. So I've been asked to talk about communicating science diplomacy, and of course, different ways to look at it. And the angle I want to take today is actually how to communicate science to diplomats. Of course, there's an issue also about, communicating science diplomacy more general to the general public. But I want to focus on science communication to diplomats because that's the world in which I moved in the last years, and where I've gained some kind of hands-on knowledge. So now I'm just looking why. There we are. Okay. But before going into more detail on the communication side, I think we need to be aware of what's actually happening in the world. First of all, we need to be aware that, of course, science itself is changing. Yeah? So science is become more open, more transparent. We have all these kind of initiatives towards open access. It becomes more engaging also with citizens. But also increasingly science itself is stepping into the diplomatic sphere by creating institutions like the International Science Council, by doing major global events like the World Science Forum, which a couple of years ago was dedicated to science for peace, by the fact that organizations like CERN do have now an official observer status at the UN General Assembly. And of course, we know also the more long-standing examples like the IPCC, of course. Now, at the same time, diplomacy is changing. It's changing quite a lot, actually, especially also with the advent of digital social media. And you see here just some examples of world leaders using digital social media in many ways. So we live now in a world where kind of declarations of war are not done by an exchange of notes, but by 150, 540 character tweet. We of course see the use of everything from YouTube to Instagram to etc. And if you just take the very recent picture down to the right there, you see the Chinese leader discussing with Justin Trudeau that in the past obviously wouldn't have been shared instantly on social media. But also science diplomacy as a concept is changing. And science diplomacy went through this, I would call, honeymoon phase a couple of years ago, open to the world and all the great things we can do with science diplomacy and engaging with everybody. But in recent years, we also saw much more nuances around issues like foreign interference. And even now, if you take this year going into issues like scientific sanctions, and one can ask whether sanctions are actually a tool of science diplomacy as well. So it is actually both carrots and sticks. Now, this is, of course, happening against the background where political challenges and global crises become more and more systemic and interconnected. And we've seen it in the recent crisis. So take the pandemic, one of the big impacts of COVID-19 was actually on education and kids not being able to go to school, obviously undermining the sustainable development goals in terms of education. Obviously not related at all to public health, but obviously this was one of these interconnections. We see it with the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine and its impact on global food security. So we are going to see more and more of these connections. So the world is getting in a way much more difficult to explain also, which is also a challenge for scientists, by the way. But certainly the importance of scientific expertise is increasing. Take the global commons. So that's the polar zones, the oceans, outer space, the internet. So global commons traditionally have been de facto governed by science. Scientific activities were happening there basically. But in past years, we see global commons increasingly becoming politicized, militarized, commercialized. So if you think of, Russia a couple of years ago, putting its flag on the North Pole, if you take China, transforming coral reefs in the South China Seas into military air bases, but also if you see American billionaires being active in outer space up to the point where now Elon Musk is owning half of all active satellites in Earth orbit. So this is, of course, challenging international relations and diplomacy as well. And then, of course, in a way, scientific and technological progress is also a driver of diplomacy, because technological progress is advancing at very high speed. And this influences the geopolitical balance of power. So think of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, mRNA vaccines, and many other issues. And so it really becomes increasingly political. And one of the consequences is that actually science and technology files are creeping up more and more on the political agenda and also on the diplomatic agenda, of course. And then, of course, we have disinformation spreading, or alternative truths, which we traditionally used to call lies. And all of this is, of course, undermining democracy, it's undermining multilateralism. And there was actually a very interesting article I can recommend, recently published by Dan Sarewitz and Andrea Saltelli, where they were arguing that in the same way that churches lost their truth monopoly with the invention of book printing 500 years ago, nowadays science is losing its truth monopoly with the advent of digital social media. So, so there are more and more kind of people communicating out there, and you never know actually how serious is it. Are they deceiving you either willingly or unwillingly? And this is, of course, a major issue. We always make the joke that in Germany used to have 80 million coaches of the national football team. And it turned out during the pandemic that Germany also has 80 million hobby epidemiologists. So that's, of course, a challenge also for communicating science. Now, I want to share with you perhaps some ideas, some practical experiences on how to improve communications at the science diplomacy interface. And I'm showing here just a tweet, Mr. Borrell, the High Representative for Foreign Relations of the EU. He tweeted this some months ago. So he was visiting the telescopes in Chile, in the Atacama Desert, and was tweeting about science diplomacy. And as of course, linked to the fact that, let's say, we encouraged him actually when he visits Chile to pass by the telescopes and actually get some scientific input. Now, I think, first of all, I think it is very important to make the evidence useful. So, of course, diplomatic services, they are not, have never been kind of free of science and technology. They've always used scientific evidence, but it is very important to make it useful for the diplomats and tailor it to their needs. We see this, of course, happening, for instance, in the IPCC, which is a well-established institution. And you know, you've seen it playing out again also at the recent climate conference. You know, there's the negotiations going on, and we shouldn't forget that actually it is diplomats that negotiates agreement. It's not scientists. But when they are in negotiation and say the other sides make some proposal, then the diplomat must be able to turn it to the scientist in the back row and say, could you run this through your model and tell me whether we can give a thumbs up or thumbs down to that proposal? So that's kind of very on-the-spot interaction with diplomats. But of course, also more generally speaking, in many ways, as because of the reasons which I explained earlier, diplomatic services are very much dependent on input from scientists. And what is very important, this I've always tried to do, is to put the evidence into a geopolitical context. So you cannot just throw evidence at the diplomats and hope they will take it. You need to make another step. And for this to happen, it is very important that you're, of course, aware when you are working in a science advisory position, that you're aware, of course, what is happening in science, but also what is on the mindset of the diplomats. Yeah, so when I worked as a science advisor in the European External Action Service, I also regularly read the diplomatic newspapers the diplomats were reading just to see what is on their mind. And what I've always tried to do is to put evidence into a geopolitical context, to making this additional step of contextualizing the scientific evidence. And what I'm showing you here is a very practical example, because when I started in the External Action Service on the 1st of August, then of course, when you are new in your job, your desk is empty and you think, where do I start? And at that moment, Mr. Putin came to my rescue, so to speak, when he announced a few days later the Sputnik V as the first vaccine against COVID-19. So I thought, okay, this is a good opportunity now to tell a little bit to the diplomats what actually vaccines are about, what type of vaccines are there, how are they being regulated, but also thinking the step further, what does such an announcement mean in a geopolitical context? If you have different vaccines against COVID coming from different countries at different points in time. So Russians first here, and then of course later on other vaccines, but also then of course also thinking, okay, how serious is actually this announcement? Is this peer reviewed? And in this case, for instance, they've authorized the Sputnik V just after having tested this on a few hundred individuals. And it was clear that it was rather a kind of PR trick than serious, because it was they hadn't gone through the compulsory phase 3 clinical trials, which again means that of course you need to explain what a phase 3 clinical trial is. So contextualizing is very important. Foresight is very important, because you need to understand that diplomacy is a very quick business. Because every day, somewhere in the world, there is a natural disaster, there's a coup d'etat, there's whatever things happening. So you are kind of always threatened to get into this treadmill of running behind the diplomats, so to speak. And this, of course, you can counteract by doing foresight and think in advance, you know, what is happening on the science side, which may impact international relations a few years down the line. Some of you may have heard about GESTA, the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator in Switzerland. So they are, for instance, producing now every year what they call a science breakthrough radar, which basically scans the world of science and technology, what is kind of developing and what may impact us in 5 years and 10 years and 25 years. So I have done this as well. So here again with the example of COVID vaccines. So I was kind of monitoring which are the vaccines being developed in different parts of the world and how it may impact international relations. Yeah, for instance, Cuba was developing its own vaccine. Iran was developing its own vaccine. Of course, all this has also geopolitical connotations. But no matter how good your advice is and how good your evidence is, it needs to fall on a fertile ground. And that's why I've always tried to constantly feed science into the system, so to speak. So in the European External Action Service, they have a weekly newsletter called the Readings Digest, which is sent every week to all the diplomats. And what I've done is regularly including their articles from Science or Nature or the Lancet and similar journals, just to make sure that there's always a bit of science and technology in there. And this is kind of creating a kind of an environment where diplomats get used to read things about science. And this helps then further down the line when you actually want to talk about a specific scientific subject with them. Very important, it's very important to also find allies. And you find them in the most unexpected corners. To me, it was very funny on my first day when I started in the External Action Service that I found out that I had put the Office of the Advisor on Science and Technology next to the Office of the Advisor on Religious Affairs and Faith. And I was thinking, okay, that's going to be fun here. But actually, it turns out that I had much more things to do with my colleague than I thought. Because coming back, for instance, again to the issue of COVID-19, if you talk about vaccine hesitancy and want to roll out vaccines in Africa, for instance, and there were surveys in Africa showing that in some African countries, when you ask the question, what is more effective against COVID-19, prayers or vaccines, then in many countries, a majority of the population said prayers, which showed that actually I had to team up with my colleague. And this I did also on other instances, of course, looking at across the organization, there were people who are kind of interested in scientific subjects and use them as allies, both as multipliers for the messages I wanted to get out, but also the other way around, to use them as a sounding board for the advice I was giving. So it's very important to identify those allies. And then, of course, use what we have. And I mentioned at the beginning, Mr. Borrell visiting the telescopes in Chile. Of course, let's not forget research infrastructures. They very frequently get the visits of royals and presidents. It's, by the way, also the case for ICTP in Trieste. And you see it in CERN, you see it in many other infrastructures. Of course, because politicians, but also diplomats, they kind of like to get out of their daily environment as well and see something fascinating. And there's always a good opportunity to communicate science, not just the science that is happening in these facilities, but also science more generally and what science diplomacy, of course, can do for diplomats. Now, when you communicate science, it is very obviously very important to use a language everybody understands. I mean, that's kind of a very basic fact for when we communicate science to a lay public or also to policymakers and diplomats. But it's also very important to use visuals because few people can imagine, what a number means. So if you tell them, look, this is the amount of rainforest that is destroyed every 3 seconds on the planet, 1, 2, 3, and it disappeared, then of course it is very visual and impactful. And in fact, I also had to say from my experiences when I worked at External Action Service, whenever I had kind of produced a visual, an infographic, a map, something like this, always it was much more picked up by diplomats, including then also in political meetings. Narratives are very important and they are very powerful. and they're becoming increasingly important also in diplomacy. Also in the context, of course, of all the disinformation you're facing. And what you see here is probably perhaps the best known graph in the history of science. So I'm showing you here a graph without any numbers on it, without any definitions on it. But I guess all of you will know what this graph means and what this graph describes. Well, it's of course the measurement of CO2 at the Mauna Loa Observatory. And why has this graph been so impactful? It is of course because it tells you a story. It tells you the story of global warming and of the impact humans have on the planet. So it is very important to use such narratives and to become, in a way, storytellers. This is, I think, perhaps a characteristic which is becoming more important, which we are not so much used to as scientists, because we want to use the facts and, communicate exact numbers. But this storytelling parts, we shouldn't forget, because also others who are communicating, they are using anecdotes. And then people tell me, yeah, but we are scientists, we cannot use anecdotes. But I can tell you an anecdote which is underpinned by the scientific evidence is much more powerful than an anecdote without scientific evidence. So these are things that I think we need to learn. And of course, timing is very important in diplomacy. As I mentioned, it is a very quickly moving business. And generally in science advice for policymaking, I've times again and again seen that, wonderful reports have been delivered shortly or a few weeks after the political decision has been taken. And that's, of course, totally useless. There are certain points in time where people are receptive for the evidence, especially because that's the moments where they really need it. And that's why it is also important to have people at this science policy or science diplomacy interface who understand the timing issues, of course, the long cycles in which science works, but also the very short cycles in which, in that case, diplomats work. And at the end of the day, I think it is very important that we equip diplomats with the arguments to defend the evidence in public, because we want them to use the evidence. But we need also to equip them with the arguments, because just put yourself in the shoes of this gentleman here. You have all sorts of cameras and microphones pointing at you, and now please defend the evidence. And of course, it is very important that we kind of find ways how to use this evidence. Again, it can be used by introducing with an anecdote. It can be used by contextualizing in more broader societal terms. But to show them, look, here's an easy way how you can sell the evidence, so to speak. And this makes it much easier also for them to pick it up. Which also brings me perhaps to one final remark. And that's a more general statement. I think it's a mistake many scientists are making. We tend to spend a lot of time preaching to the converted. So to the people who like science, who show up at parliamentary evenings, who engage with us. Of course, that's very comfortable for us. The other mistake many scientists are making, they lose time and waste time with all these lunatics, this climate change is a hoax type of people, and vaccine cause autism, and all these kind of nonsense. But we are not going to convert them no matter how many evidence we are throwing at them. And we forget that actually there's a big majority of politicians in the middle who are unengaged and who can be convinced by arguments, who perhaps haven't found the access to science because they hated physics at school, or they think that we were going to embarrass them with our knowledge or whatever. But they are actually the ones that we need to win, so to speak, with the science. And the ones, and this, of course, requires a bit getting out of our comfort zone. But actually, that is, I think, also something I would to tell those, yeah, but what are we doing, with these populists in government and so on? I think you need to address the people who are actually voting for them and engage with them. And that's something by showing empathy to the public and showing empathy to what the other side is thinking, rather than, getting out of our ivory tower and we have the solution, but a little bit showing more empathy, and which brings me to perhaps a last point, and that's the issue of emotions. I think we need to get more emotional in our communications. And when I say emotions, of course, it shouldn't be emotions in the sense that we are biasing our evidence through emotions. But I think nobody is forbidding scientists to touch people's hearts. And that's, I think, something we need to learn in our engagement with the general public, but of course also with policymakers and diplomats. And that's where I want to stop my presentation. I'm happy to engage in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Gianmarco, I hope it's not just from me, but from everyone, a huge thank you, because I personally found it very engaging and stimulating. In the second part of your presentation, you even went to distill some practical advice for people to engage in much more effective communication. So you mentioned storytelling, you mentioned timing, you mentioned the visuals, and just now you mentioned the putting the emotion in. I think you also used an expression, getting out of the comfort zone. And I think all of this should be highly treasured advice. But I've got some considerations or questions, but I'm not the priority. And I'm sure that your presentation triggered some reflection. So I would like to see first, before I ask you anything, from the audience, let's see if there are any comments or questions. I don't need my glasses to see far away, but I still don't see any.
Don't be shy.
I'm happy to start.
Okay, we have, please go ahead.
I'm Michelle Riedlinger. I'm here as a visitor as well for the
can you hear?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, if you speak loud, it's okay.
Oh, yeah, sorry, everyone. Michelle Riedlinger, you mentioned getting out of your comfort zone, and I think it's something that we all struggle with. You know, it is very easy to go or to participate in those places where you are already welcome. Do you have some good examples of how researchers or people working at that boundary spanning interface can get out of their comfort zone and talk with voters or people who aren't necessarily, even the politicians you talked with? What are those kinds of things? You said working with having allies, so I know that's one example, but yeah, maybe if you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, well, I think it is important to create, it's not just about allies, but it's also about creating the spaces where this dialogue can happen. And I want to give you a practical trick, which Mark Ferguson told me. He used to be the chief science advisor to the Irish government. And he had this problem, you know, there was a group of politicians who just didn't want to engage, who are not interested in science at all. And what he did then is he organized a science competition in schools in the constituency of that politician. And then he told the politician, look, you should hand over the award to the pupils who won this competition. We're going to invite them to the parliament and you're going to hand over this award. And of course, I'm going to take care the journalists are going to be there to take pictures. And of course, that's something all politicians like to do, you know, especially when it's with people in their constituency. So he organized a science competition. The kids went to the capital, and then they arranged, you know, this hand over this award. And that, of course, was an opportunity to talk with that politician about science, because the kids were, of course, explaining what they had done in their school project. And of course, you as the scientist accompanying the event could use the opportunity to engage with the politician. So it's just one example, just very, very practical one. So it is, you know, think what is on the politician's mind and how to find an entry point. And very often these entry points, they can be, you know, some very unexpected corner. You can talk to the politician about something totally different, can be about football or about anything. And then at some point of discussion, you find the angle where you can put the science in. And my experience is also, especially when you think of controversial topics, yeah, so GMOs, fracking, nuclear energy, all these kind of more controversial scientific issues. There are ways to open the discussion. And when you then, once you enter into a dialogue, into a discussion, then very often you find out that actually science is not the issue for them. It's not a problem for them, yeah? So when it comes to whatever, GMOs, gene editing, their real concern is about business ethics of multinational companies. And of course, fun to have a discussion about ethics of multinational companies, but that wouldn't be a scientific debate anymore, you know? And this way you can also find, look, and kind of separate these kind of more ethical issues from the more scientific ones, where you can say, okay, and here's the evidence, and that's why we think this is safe, and here are the arguments. And then, of course, this politician can still say, okay, yeah, but I have a different opinion, and that's fine. We're living in a democracy, and of course, there are many factors that influence politicians, not just science. So that's something we need to accept when they kind of even ignore the evidence. But at least you have made your point and you found an entry point to bring the evidence across. And that's, I think, the starting point. But for this, it's really important to create these spaces where the dialogue can happen.
Thank you for your answer. And I think the question was actually really good. I think that there are many cases in which scientists or science communicators feel stuck because they don't know what steps to take. So I thought the question was very relevant. Perhaps if there were a series or groups of success stories and or inspirational models, a collection, you know, of cases, then that would perhaps very much help others. And they say, oh, look, that happened and that led to a result also, yeah? But let me see if there's any other, yes. Speak very loud,
yeah,
please.
I'll try that. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, thank you for your lecture. You spoke of foresight and the need to for politicians to actually be able to see what effects science will have in the future. But we always find that politicians are more preoccupied with the now than the future, and that's why, for example, it is very difficult to take steps to address climate change or something like that. How do we communicate the urgency of looking into the future and seeing that it is important to address these problems now?
My answer would be the best thing is by looking into the back and showing actually the diplomats, you know, how the problems could have been avoided by more foresight. Yeah, I mean the Russian war of aggression of Ukraine. I mean, it wasn't a surprise. It has been mounting up for a number of years already, since at least the invasion from in Crimea. So a little bit more foresight, and also in a sense of scenario building, where you can show, look, here are different scenarios, and these are the ones you need to have on your mind. You need to cater for. Of course, we all know that, well, future has not yet happened, and there's always uncertainty related to it. But I think we know already, of course, as scientists, also from history, how science has revolutionized the world in many ways. And we know already, I mean, for many years, you know, how, for instance, quantum technologies are going to influence our lives. And then I think it is very important to do this forward-looking exercise, and ideally to do it together with the diplomats, not to come to them with a kind of ready-made product, but also kind of taking them out of their daily routine, so to speak, sit down with them and think, okay, and how's the world going to look like in 10 or 20 years from now? And the scientists can bring, you know, what they think is coming out of the labs in terms of technology developments we are seeing. But at the same time, of course, it's very important that the diplomats bring their view, you know, how China is developing or how other countries are developing. And combining these two perspectives actually produce very powerful scenarios that can inform them. So I think it's a little bit of, you know, also establishing the mechanisms to do this on a regular basis.
Thank you, Gianmarco. If I can latch onto that, because it's such a good point that you were asking about. And Gianmarco, you mentioned about foresight. May I ask you what you think about combining foresight with also promoting and nurturing a sense of responsibility? Because sometimes it seems to me that people are not actually taking enough responsibility, and people, of course, mainly it would be policymakers. So a question I would throw at them is, are you doing the best interest of the now and of you, or the best interest of your children? Because most politicians have children, and if they have children, they are parents. Therefore, there must be some kind of caring and therefore emotional, psychological projection towards the future. Because you were asking about looking at the future.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, intergenerational justice is really a key issue, and we all of us, we are human beings. We are scientists as well, believe it or not. You know, we are also fathers and mothers. We also have kids, and also and then that's also important to bring that across. Also to create this, as I mentioned, the empathy, to show, look, I as a scientist, I have hopes and fears like everybody else. Yeah, so I'm not kind of totally disconnected from it. And this creates a kind of an emotional bonding with the policymaker, that you can say, yes, I understand your concern, but you also understand, you know, that's on my mind. If it's on my mind, it's also on many other people's mind. And that's why it is important to you know, think of the future and prepare for it, and leave obviously a world ideally that is better for our children than it has been for us, because so far it has always been true that kind of every generation lived in better world than the previous one. But we are at a point where for the first time in history, this may go in a different way. And that's why it is important, you know, to have this long-term perspective. Yes.
Thank you so much. It's a huge, huge issue, what you raised, intergenerational justice. Yeah, very fantastic. Yeah, question there.
So
perhaps come closer because of the audio.
If I didn't misunderstand you, so you were mentioning that one should try to be more emotional also with the communication. The question is, isn't it too dangerous, in the sense that most of the anti-scientific movement, opinionists, and so on and so forth, they usually based all their communication on emotions, no? On empathy, on sympathy for the audience, you know, evoking ancestral kind of fears, you know. So if you do that as a scientist, aren't you going to fight on a ground which you might not be very comfortable with, and you might end up losing the advantage of the others?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very important point, and I know it's something that really excites scientists when I mention this. But as you rightly said, the kind of populists, I mean, they are very experienced in using emotions strategically for their interests. And if we just come, as you know, as the Mr. Spock type of people, as the robots, you know, he is the pure logic, he is the reason, we are not going to win the argument, because emotion, we are emotional human beings, right? Now, what is very important, of course, we need to be and stay the voice of reasons. So our evidence must be as unbiased as it can be. It will never be unbiased, yeah, precisely because we are humans. But and of course, there are values behind the evidence we deliver, and we all have values, and it should be unbiased. But in our form of communication, I think we need to be able to reach people's hearts, not just their minds. Yeah, and so again, one of the advice that was given by me by a colleague was, you know, when he was asked, he said, you know, if I have come with the evidence and the other side comes with anecdotes, what do I do? Well, then you need to have better anecdotes than the other side. Yeah, and as I said, if the anecdote is underpinned by evidence, it's even stronger. So this comes back to the storytelling issue. Yeah. So I think we need to be able to touch people's hearts. And I sometimes use in my presentations an image which shows Usain Bolt when he won the 100-meter world record, and he's standing next to this big clock, this big watch that says the record time, you know, and it's, of course, it's a scientific instrument that measures time, you know. It took him whatever 9.56 seconds to reach the 100 meters. That's very technical scientific information. But next to it, you have the athlete with a Jamaican flag around the shoulders, and the combination of the two actually creates the emotion and the story, which is about the fastest man in the world. You know, and that's this kind of stories we might need to get into. Of course, staying the voice of reasons, staying really with solid, unbiased evidence, but in a way of communication, I think we need to learn to touch people's hearts.
Very powerful, very interesting. There's another question.
Yeah. How do you take into account cultural differences around the globe, let's say, when developing a coherent message, especially with diplomats that are, let's say, border between different, that operates at the border between different countries? Can you give some advice? Because a message that can work in a culture could be perceived differently in another one. Do you have some advice on this?
I think you raise a very important issue. And that's, by the way, also a hard lesson the European Commission had to learn. Because the European Commission, traditionally, you know, it had one press release and it went out to 27 member states, okay? But at some point, the European Commission understood actually that communicating with somebody in France needs to be different from communicating with somebody in Greece or somebody in Finland, because of the cultural differences, which we have also within the European Union. So you need to tailor, you always need to tailor your messages to the audience. And some issues may be more important to them than others. And that is why it is so important also to have people on the ground embedded in this culture, who really understand how the society ticks, and who can give the kind of certain tweaks to a message. Yeah, of course, the message as such will still be the same. It will still be the same evidence for everybody. But you need to adapt it to a local context. And this, again, it can be a story, an example which you can take. It can be what I also do is to make a joke or something. Yeah. I remember once I was preparing for my boss, the chief science advisor at the time, a presentation in Greece, and it was shortly after the Euro crisis. You know, and I thought, okay, how can I win the Greek audience, so to speak? And I prepared a presentation where on the first slide you saw a euro coin, and she was saying, okay, when people from Brussels come to Greece, they always talk about this euro. And then on the second slide, but I want to do something different. I want to talk about this, and I showed the backside of the Greek euro coin, which shows the owl as a symbol of wisdom and of knowledge. You know, and that was entry. I want to talk about this side of the euro coin, which is about the knowledge and about wisdom, and that's kind of creating also a little bit, having a little bit kind of how should I say, a subtle, you know, feeling for what is important to people. You know, in that Greek context, taking, for instance, examples from Greek history, when actually Greece was a global superpower in science and technology. And the same way, I would kind of tweak a presentation I would be giving in Italy and Spain or in other places. So it is important really to contextualize them and taking these cultural differences in. But for this, of course, you need also a little bit, ideally, people on the ground who can advise you on the messaging.
Thank you, Gianmarco. We have. I would like to take the ladies first.
For sure.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can come closer if you wish, just to make sure that your voice is heard well.
So as a certain point you mentioned that normally policymakers are not that concerned on speaking about science, but they are concerned about economics and ethics and so on. So maybe they are open to speak about science.
thing is, what I'm thinking about is that at the end of the day, the problem even in climate change, they end up being economical, systemic, and so on. So the question is, us as a scientific communicator, should we just be focused on the evidence that will be said several times and the science as if science was completely outside of the rest of the world, the economical and so on? Or should we take a step further? What do you think? Should we just say science or try to mix, because they are actually mixed? But what is more efficient in the communication?
Yes. Thank you for the question. So my answer to this would be, of course, we as science, we have a particular role to play in society. We are the ones who provide the scientific reasoning, who provide the evidence, which is a very important part of the scientific debate. And I also told you why it is important, because decisions that are based on scientific evidence are more sustainable. Quite simply, because scientific evidence does not change with the change of government. You can have today a left government, tomorrow a right government. The scientific evidence will stay the same. So if you base policies on evidence, your policies are more sustainable. That's one of the messages I'm passing to politicians. You know, if you have a want to have a long-lasting legacy with your policy, then base it on evidence. Now, of course, we need to, as I mentioned earlier, we need to take, of course, into the consideration that politicians are influenced by many issues. It's not just science, of course. It's, you know, lobby groups, it is electoral concerns, it's, of course, religious beliefs and kind of ethical values and many other issues. It's pressure from the street, pressure from the media, etc. And I'm always the first one to say, look, it is in a democracy, it is okay if politicians ignore the evidence. Because we live in a democracy, they are elected by the people, I'm not elected. So I need to accept if they ignore the evidence. But what I want is that they are accountable. So I'm going to ask the question, if you ignore the evidence, please explain why. And there may be a good reason, because I fear that there's more unemployment or whatever. Be transparent about it. That's what I always ask politicians, you know. You can ignore the evidence, but please tell people why you do so, because then we get a transparent debate. Now, of course, thinking of the wider societal impact of science, as I mentioned also earlier, I think it is very important to engage with the people who are electing, with the electorate, so to speak. Because at the end of the day, elections, they reflect the will of the people, you know. And if we are concerned about, you know, too many, you know, non-evidence-based politicians being elected, so to speak, then we need to engage with the people and with society. And of course, also with sectors of society, with NGOs, with businesses, etc. Because at the end of the day, we must understand, you know, what drives them? What are their concerns? They may be, for instance, a very legitimate concern of people that they are losing their quality of life or their lifestyle because of climate change or because of, you know, different, you know, economic developments, etc. And these developments may be driven also by technologies, you know, technologies replacing people, replacing workforce. And of course, any transition has winners and losers. Yeah. So it is important to engage with the losers, so to speak, who are really concerned and who then vote accordingly and find ways, you know, how to manage the transition and help, you know, also the politicians to manage a transition, to get the people with them, to get them on board and to offer new opportunities through lifelong learning or other mechanisms. So I think we need to be part in this game in also providing options and possibilities which we can show in a way, also giving in a way hope to people that yes, the new world can be better and science and technology are here to help you.
Thank you. There's for sure at least one more question. Please go ahead.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Yes. In this discussion, many times we made mention of the word evidence. But I think that especially during the pandemic, we have seen that in Italy, but everywhere, with so many epidemiologists, virologists participating to talk show or to media interview, they clearly show that when we have some big events like pandemic, we have a lot of uncertainty, no? So first of all, I think that we should reflect. I would like to have a comment from you about the relationship between evidence and uncertainty, which in some cases, like in pandemic, is something say that is a radical uncertainty, because it's not just that we don't know, but we don't know how to know. Okay. And the second point is, again, during pandemics, we clearly had the evidence that scientists can present themselves on a public stage, apparently giving advice, but at the same time they have their interests. Now, many times they don't give advice; they make advocacy, which is a bit different concept. So I don't want to be too provocative, but I think that we should reflect even on this. There is no, I mean, of course, there is misinformation, populism, and so on. But on the other hand, I think we can see that there is a coherent bulk of people called scientists. We are on the same side, or they think the same thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I must say you raise a very, very important point that is close to my heart. And I had also some good discussions with Professor Brusaferro about it, who was one of the key Italian COVID advisors. Because Italy was a country that was hit very early on in the pandemic, where there was really few, close to none knowledge about this new virus. So how are you kind of providing advice in such a context? Yeah, of course, you base it on historical experiences, on your knowledge as a virologist, but of course, you know, you don't have yet sufficient evidence on what this particular beast is going to be like. And I think it is very important to be transparent about what we know and what we don't know. So we shouldn't claim we have the ultimate solution. Yeah, I always tell politicians, you know, I can give you my best guess as a scientist. Yeah, with all my knowledge I have. It may still be wrong, of course. Yeah, but I guess if you kind of base your advice on kind of the best possible guess, so to speak, and evidence-informed guess, it's still better than just a shot in the dark. And the problem we are facing, of course, that when you have a lot of uncertainty, you have a lot of different scientific opinions. And everybody is communicating. So it is, and politicians, they are faced with this cacophony of science. And who should I believe now? Should I believe the guy who just spoke on a talk show? Should I believe my cousin who is a biologist, or whatever, whoever? Yeah. And one of the tricky issues we have seen during the pandemic, and was, in my view, very dangerous, was when politicians said, "I'm being led by the science."
Yeah.
Yeah, because what they do is to put the blame on the scientists. You know, if it doesn't work, the scientist, of course, is responsible, and I can put the blame on the scientist. And if it works well, of course, it's my own politician's decision that because I took this decision, we were successful. And that's something, of course, we need to be careful about. And that's where it comes back to the issue of role in society. Well, I think we need to make very clear it is not us scientists who take decisions. We have decision makers who are elected for this when they work in a political environment, or who are kind of appointed to this as, you know, administrator of a public authority. They take decisions. What we can do is to provide advice on the best possible evidence we have, acknowledging, of course, the uncertainties. And of course, we need to be transparent and communicate these uncertainties. And my experience with politicians is they are not so much interested whether the uncertainty is, you know, 17.4% or 8.9%. What they want to know, what does this uncertainty mean? What's the worst case scenario? You know, at the end of the day, might it cost me $1 million more, or is it the end of life on the planet? And it's this kind of issue you need to bring across. And my advice also always to politicians: if you put your bets on mainstream science, then it's better than just putting your bets on some maverick science, which doesn't mean that mainstream science is always right, but revolutions in science are rather rare.
Good, great. Before I check for more questions, let me just check with Giacomo. I've lost track of time.
We have like 5 minutes, maybe one more question.
Okay, let's see if there's one more question. I do not see any questions. Perhaps I can dig one that I thought before, also connected to many that have come out. You have provided us today with some really precise, I would say, tools and techniques to try to be better science communicator and even to reach out to some of these policymakers. However, may I go beyond the economic argument that was made, because the economic argument may be that they're not going to listen to us because of the linear economy and the profit and so on. But there is another issue that many people are very concerned about, and that is the issue of science literacy, which is that depending on the country you're in and the educational system you're in, some of these politicians and policymakers, excuse my language, but they're actually extremely ignorant. So even if you reach out with the various tools you gave us, you may still not break through because their mentality is shaped upon a particular education which is really lacking in basic science. So how do you see this obstacle?
Yes, I think this is an important issue, and I alluded to it in my initial presentation, kind of feeding a little bit science constantly into the system, so to speak. But you also need to catch the people where they are. I mean, you know, all the people love to go to science museums or watch dinosaurs, you know. Let's even kind of say the more kind of non-engaged politicians will go with their kids to watch some fascinating science stuff in a museum, for instance. These are, of course, places where you can catch people and bring the message across. But it's a much more bigger challenge if you think as society as a whole, understanding of society, of science and society. And it's a question I'm getting actually very frequently when I'm talking in Latin America. Because in Latin America, countries are spending very few money on research, you know. Research budgets are usually something like 0.2, 0.4% of the GDP, and not the 2 or 3% which we see in Europe. So science has a very difficult standing. There's a very few investment in science. And this is, of course, an issue where I think you need to think, okay, how to reach the people in such an environment. And what I always tell them, look, please do a telenovela where a beautiful looking microbiologist falls in love with a smart minister of finance, and just a kind of a tool where how you can reach people, right? And you need, again, that comes back to the issue about the cultural context.
Wonderful. I would say wonderful. I think this is really an extraordinary presentation and discussion with a follow-up discussion. This is the first event or lecture in the workshop that CISA is organizing, and I believe that you have given us some extremely useful information, advice, and viewpoints, some of which are even technical. But you've gone beyond. You've gone beyond that, because you made us understand that effective science communication is not just a technique. It's almost an art as well, because you really have to refine it and fine-tune it depending on the condition, the context, the religion, the educational background, and so on. So I think it was very thought-provoking, and I hope for all the people here also very inspirational. So I would like us to thank Dr. Jacob Mueller very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for taking the time, your time, and then also your PowerPoint slides, very powerful. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Max, and thanks everybody in Trieste. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Marco. Bye-bye.
Grazie.